Hello and welcome to Earth Science Chapter 2, Earth as a System. Let's get started. The main things we're going to be covering in this chapter is a little bit more in-depth look at the Earth itself. We're going to be looking at the energy on the Earth, how that energy moves around, some of the different areas and systems of the Earth, as well as a little bit of some ecology stuff. So let's jump right into it. First off, let's talk about the Earth itself, what it is, how old it is, things like that. You'll notice on your notes, and you should have your notes out right now, the very first thing it asks is, how old is the Earth? The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. 4.6 billion years old. Most of the Earth, 71% of it, is covered in water. But that water is a really, really tiny, minuscule, thin layer. In reality, that water is about 1% or less of the whole Earth itself. The Earth is actually just rock, almost entirely rock. A lot of it's molten, a lot of it's metallic, a lot of it is so deep beneath your feet that you will never see it, and nobody else will ever at any point in time. Even the crust on which we stand on right now, which is many miles deep, only accounts for a small, tiny percentage of the Earth. The Earth itself has a mass of 5.4 hundreds, thousand, million, billion, trillion, quintillion. That's a lot. That's a huge amount of material. And the distance to the center of the Earth is actually pretty large as well. How many of you guys have ever, let's say, for example, left your house on a very far distance trip? Well, unless you've literally left the entirety of the United States and North America, and you traveled somewhere, say, to Europe or to Asia, you have probably not even traveled the distance that it would take to reach the core of the Earth. Think about that for a moment, and think about how deep it is underneath of your own feet, and how much material is down there. Another thing to think about is how much energy is down there. We like to think of big energy events on the surface of the Earth as things like hurricanes or tornadoes. But in reality, the single largest source of energy here on Earth is down in the core, and it forms all of the plate tectonics, it forms all of the volcanoes. It has the ability to literally move the entirety of entire crusts across the surface of the Earth. That's a huge amount of energy. But most of the energy on the surface, the very skin of the Earth, comes from the sun. And that's because sunlight basically heats up our atmosphere and we're able to absorb it here. But most of the energy in the Earth itself comes from the core. So, let's talk a little bit more about the core and what's down there and what kind of things we know about it. First off, the Earth's interior. What is it and how do we know what it looks like? The Earth's interior, we think, is made up of about 5 major layers. They are different layers of different materials. Sometimes they're solid, sometimes they're liquid. They're usually made up of different things, sometimes metal, sometimes rocks. We know what the inside of the Earth largely looks like, partly because of earthquakes. When an earthquake happens here on the surface of the Earth, it rings the Earth like a bell. And the vibrations from that earthquake not only travel along the surface where we feel it, but it also travels through the inside of the Earth. And when it interacts with different things, like it hits liquids or it hits solids, the earthquake waves change on the other side of the Earth. And we can detect those using things called seismographs and seismometers. The earthquakes tell us a whole lot about what happens, and because earthquakes happen all over the Earth, we have a good idea of what the inside of the Earth looks like. So let's talk about that a little bit. What does the inside of the Earth look like, and what are those layers? Right now, we think that the Earth has 5 layers. The lithosphere is on the farthest outside. On your notes, you should notice that it says number 3. 5 layers of the Earth from outside to inside. Letter A should be lithosphere. Then asthenosphere, and you can see it blown up over here, lithosphere and asthenosphere. And it's important to note that lithosphere and asthenosphere combined together are pretty thin. I mean, when we actually math out how thick our crust is compared to the rest of the Earth. You can imagine the Earth like a giant apple, and in reality our crust is actually thinner than the skin of that apple would be. The skin, or our crust, is very, very thin. The lithosphere is solid rock. The asthenosphere is more of a plastic-like rock, and it's usually what we move around on when the plate tectonics are moving around. They move around a couple centimeters every year. Underneath of that, the third layer is called the mesosphere. This is where most of the big lava and all that kind of stuff shoots out of volcanoes onto the surface of the Earth. It's a mixture of rock and metal. We have the outer core, outer core. It is not the deepest one, outer core. It's mostly made up of liquid metal, and it moves around a lot, and that actually has a really big impact on everything around the Earth. It drives most of the volcanoes and everything else. This is what drives a whole lot. And then the last one down in there is the inner core. And the inner core is mostly solid nickel and iron, as well as all the heaviest elements in the Earth. Things like uranium, plutonium, all the stuff on the periodic table that's really big, really messy, really radioactive, it all goes down there. And we actually think that's one of the reasons why the core of the Earth is so hot and why it's still hot even after 4.6 billion years of it moving around. We think that the inner core has large amounts of radioactive material, and that radioactive material is breaking down and making heat, just like a nuclear reactor would. Let's move on and talk about each one of these layers a little bit more in depth. First one, lithosphere. Solid outer layer that consists of the crust and the upper part of the mantle. The lithosphere is 50 to 300 kilometers thick. Now let's talk about that just for a little bit. First off, we actually have two types of lithosphere, two types of crust. One is oceanic and one is continental. That's kind of why we have areas of the Earth that are underwater and areas of the Earth that are above water, because the areas of the Earth that are underwater have a different type of crust, and that crust sits deeper or farther down on the surface of the Earth. Oceanic crust is really, really heavy, usually made up of lots of metals, but it's only 5 to 10 kilometers thick. It's pretty thin. It's not this 15 to 300 kilometer thick number. The continental crust, on the other hand, is upwards of 15 to 80 kilometers thick. So how do we get this 300 number? Well, some parts of the lithosphere as well are parts of it that are moving around with our mountain ranges, they're moving around with volcanoes, and we kind of think that, and some parts of the plate tectonics where they're sliding underneath of each other, we think that 300 kilometers thick is the deepest that we can go. Where do you think the lithosphere is the thickest? What part of the Earth is the thickest? Mountain ranges. It's mostly mountain ranges. The asthenosphere sits underneath of it. It's a solid plastic, kind of molten plastic-like layer of the mantle. It's beneath the lithosphere. It's incredibly hot, made of mantle rock that flows very, very slowly, which allows the plate tectonics on top of it to move. How do you think we've ever drilled into either of these? Not sure. In reality, we haven't even drilled past the lithosphere yet. Several decades ago, during the Cold War, the USSR, basically Soviet Russia, tried to drill down as far as they could as kind of just an experiment. One of the big issues that they ran into was that as they kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper, it kept getting hotter and hotter. The rock kept getting more and more solid and compacted, and their bits weren't able to make it work. The deeper that you drill, the more likely your drill bit is to break and to melt. So overall, if you've ever seen movies like The Core where people drill deep down into the Earth, it's not even remotely possible for us right now. Let's move on. The mesosphere, middle part of the Earth. Not a whole lot to say about this, except that it is the largest part. It has the most material. It is very, very, very thick, and that's about it. The liquid outer core, what do we want to say about that? The liquid outer core is fairly important because When all of that liquid material is moving around, it can actually create a whole lot of interesting things here on the surface of the Earth. We think that that liquid outer core is part of the reason why we have big currents underneath of the Earth that create volcanoes on the surface in various parts. We think that that liquid outer core is going to be one of the main components that is driving things like Yellowstone, as well as one particular property of the Earth itself that we'll talk about here in a bit. And then that last layer, that solid inner core layer, that inner core layer, we think of, scientists think that right now it's basically super large crystals. And when I say large crystals, think of it like a crystal the size of Colorado, except that's just like one little spike on the crystal. It's pretty large. Let's continue onward. Earth as a magnet. Now on your notes it says the magnetosphere is created by, liquid iron of the Earth's outer core moving around in currents. So we talked about that outer core a little bit. It's right there. When that liquid metal moves around, it can conduct electricity. When it conducts electricity, it creates a magnetic field. If you've ever had a compass that points northward, that's why compasses point north in the first place. It's also used for things like GPS satellites and other satellites in general, just to figure out where they are on the surface of the Earth as they're spinning around it. This particular magnetosphere has a couple of key important factors that I want you to be aware of. First off, the magnetosphere acts like a large shield that protects us from most of the most harmful radiation from the surface of the sun. That particular radiation, if we did not have this magnetosphere, would wipe out our atmosphere all the way until there was nothing left. And then it would start beating on the surface of the Earth and essentially everything dies. Everything just goes away. This is a little bit of a simplified depiction of what the magnetosphere looks like. This is a little bit more of what we think it actually looks like. You can notice the complexity. You might notice that it has two different colors here, blue and orange. That's representing north side of a magnet and the south side of the magnet. You'll also notice that the greatest concentration of all the magnetic fields is right around here at the poles. So we have North Pole, South Pole, okay? And right now, our magnetosphere is still somewhat of a mystery to us because we don't have the ability to go inside of the Earth and actually see what's causing it. We think it's the movement of that molten metal, but we don't have the ability to observe it directly. So what do we call that, guys? You might remember from last chapter, what do we call something that is a mystery to us? We call it a phenomenon. Let's move on. Last part of this particular little section talking about the overview of the Earth is Earth's gravity in and of itself. Gravity consists primarily of just a handful of different things. Gravity was largely discovered and mathematically figured out by Newton, and he figured out that there's only two things that you need to worry about with gravity and how gravity works. And these are two things that I want you to write down somewhere on the side in the margin of your notes. These two are important. Two major factors of what affects gravity: mass and distance. The farther away objects get from each other, the less the gravity. The bigger the objects are, the more the gravity, right? So weight and mass. Weight and mass are basically the number or the total collection of the atoms that are present within a particular object. The weight is measured nowadays, now weight is a measurement of how much you're getting pulled on by gravity. Mass doesn't change with gravity. So if I were to throw you out into space, what do you think would happen? Your weight would decrease. You'd start to feel weightless. The farther away you get from Earth, the more weightless you feel. But the amount of actual atoms you have in your body, your ability to feel weight, does not decrease. It stays the same. There are some other things that can affect these two factors, the mass and the weight. Mostly weight is one of those really weird ones where if you're moving fast enough, let's say for example you're spinning around the earth really fast like in a satellite, you can actually feel weightless while still having weight. If, say for example, I were to take you up into an airplane and drop you, you can feel weightless for a period of time. And this is actually how people on the International Space Station feel. They feel weightless, but they're still close enough to Earth that Earth is still pulling on them. That's why they're in orbit in the first place. All right. And in general, nowadays we think of gravity as kind of like this large well. A well where if you start to fall into it, you'll start to spin around the outside of that well, constantly trying to fall deeper and deeper and deeper into it. But because there's no friction, because there's no air, there's no resistance, an object in space can actually spin around this well pretty much indefinitely. That's why our moon, even though the moon is being pulled on by gravity and pulled towards us, it can spin around this well for billions of years without ever falling into it. No gravity, no friction, no resistance, nothing like that. It means that objects can stay in orbit forever. This is kind of a key property of solar systems and why we haven't fallen into the sun, why the moon hasn't fallen into us, why the planets don't collide with each other as long as they keep spinning around this well. For the most part, nothing happens and they can do it forever. All right, we're out of talking about the Earth as a whole now. Now we're going to be talking about a couple of the different parts of the Earth, primarily focusing on the 4 different spheres. You'll notice these in your notes. It'll say 4 spheres of the Earth, A, B, C, and D with definitions in them. The first part is the atmosphere. The atmosphere is an incredibly thin layer of gases that are held around the surface of the Earth. The atmosphere is made up of almost all nitrogen and a little bit of oxygen, about 21% oxygen, and then all that other stuff that you guys have heard about, things like carbon dioxide or helium or hydrogen. All of those make up a very tiny percent, less than 1% of all of the gases here on the surface of the Earth. And to show you kind of a picture of this, this is the atmosphere. Incredibly tiny, incredibly thin. You don't have to go up very far before you run out of enough oxygen that you'll pass out. You can climb the tallest mountain on Earth, Mount Everest, and actually get to a point at where your oxygen level will be so low you'll just die and you won't be able to survive. Next part, hydrosphere. Hydrosphere is all the Earth's water. Hydrosphere covers up the Earth's surface. 97% of all that water on the Earth's surface is salt water. 3% is fresh water. Most of that fresh water remaining is found in ice on the northern and southern poles of the Earth. Water can be found in lakes, oceans, rivers, streams, glaciers, ice sheets, and groundwater. Which ones of these do you think is the biggest? Probably oceans, right? And then after that, it's definitely glaciers and ice sheets. But then what do you think we have the most of next? Groundwater, lakes, rivers, or streams? We'll talk about it later. But right now, the number one out of all 4 of those is groundwater. And groundwater is actually bigger than the rest of these combined and multiplied several times over. All that water makes up the hydrosphere. Hydro, meaning water. Most of what you guys are probably familiar with when it comes to hydrosphere is water cycle. Evaporation, condensation, where it turns into clouds, and then precipitation, where it goes down. And then we have erosion, we have runoff, we have streams, we have lakes, we have oceans, over and over again. All of this has its own entire unit with multiple chapters. We'll get into that later. For now, just keep that in mind. Next part. Geosphere. Geosphere is kind of what we were just talking about at the start of this lecture. Geosphere is the solid rocky part of the Earth. It extends all the way down into the core to the surface of the crust. It's everywhere where you're walking, and it makes up 99.9% of all matter here on the surface of the Earth. If you were to just randomly be teleported somewhere on the Earth, you're probably getting teleported into a rock, and you die. Moving on. Geosphere includes all rock, all soil, all continents, the ocean floor. It includes everything solid, molten, liquid, everything on the interior of the Earth. You've seen this before. We have the crust, that's where we live, very, very, very thin, thin as the skin on an apple. And then we have mantle, core, outer core, inner core, so on and so forth. The last of the four spheres that gets included here is biosphere. And this is kind of unique because we're the only planet that has a biosphere. Biosphere is where the life exists. And one of the reasons why we talk about the biosphere is because it's literally everywhere. You go to any part on Earth, even the most hostile environments, and you are going to find bacteria, organisms, and other things living there. What's more is that if you dig down, you can actually see hundreds and hundreds of feet of Earth underneath of your own feet that are affected by life. Limestone and things like that is the shells of old organisms that were in the water. Shale is the same way. Oil underneath of our own feet. Even the air that you're breathing is filled with viruses, bacteria, all sorts of random other little organisms. The biosphere is composed of all of the life forms in the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere, as well as all organic matter that is not decomposed. The biosphere extends from the deepest parts of the ocean to the atmosphere a few kilometers above the Earth's surface. Okay. And primarily one of the best ways that we denote the biosphere is with things like food webs. You've probably seen these before. Down here at the bottom you have these little guys, they're called producers. You have consumers who eat the producers. You have bigger consumers, they're called carnivores, and they eat the other little producers down here. They're called herbivores. And then up at the top, you might remember what these guys are called. They're called apex creatures. Apex creatures are animals that eat, but usually don't get eaten. Last kind of sets of parts that we're covering with those four spheres, is Earth's energy budget. And how does energy move around the Earth? Well, we said before that almost all the energy on the Earth is down into the core. But because we don't interact with that core energy hardly at all, it's all stuck down there, and it only rarely erupts out of the surface of the Earth in the form of a volcano, nearly everything that we deal with is going to be based off of sunlight energy. Well, let's talk about energy budget. What are the different forms of energy? What kind of things can we get as far as energy goes, and essentially what are we looking at here? You can get energy in all sorts of different ways. You can get energy in magnetics and electrical. You can get it in heat. You can get it in all sorts of different things, light and energy. But most of what we're going to be looking at is sunlight-based energy. So what is our energy budget for the Earth when it comes to sunlight? Well, we break it down as such. One, we have the sunlight that comes in and starts hitting the Earth. What happens to it? Well, some of it gets absorbed, some of it gets reflected, some of it goes back out into space, some of it gets absorbed into plants and other things. And what do those percentages look like? About 16% is absorbed before it ever even hits the ground by dust, ozone, other things like that. 19% are absorbed by the atmosphere, by the clouds, and things like that. A large amount is reflected by the clouds. Clouds are very, very bright white, and white is the most reflective color. Some of it's scattered by air. The 6% that's scattered by air actually makes our sky look blue when the sunlight is shining on it. It's not a reflection of the ocean as some people think. It's because the light is getting broken apart in the air. And some of it is getting absorbed by land and water. A lot of it also gets radiated later off as heat, especially at nighttime. This is one of the reasons why it gets so cold at night, is because a large amount of that energy radiates off the surface of the Earth out into space. It does not stay down here. It does not stay absorbed into the Earth. And essentially, the energy budget always comes out as zero. We might absorb a whole lot of energy at the nighttime, but by the next day when it comes up, most of that energy is radiated back into space and we start over. This is why we don't get hotter day after day after day. Instead, our temperature stays hot in the middle of the day, then it cools down at night, and then it gets hot, then it cools down, and it does this over and over for literally billions of years. We don't add to our energy every single day. It always comes out as zero. And if we get a little bit hotter one day, the nighttime energy will reflect a little bit more, or it'll radiate a little bit more, and we'll lose more energy at nighttime, and it will balance itself out. All right, last couple of things, and these ones are going to be a little bit faster than the stuff we did before because we do not go into deep detail with these. Three main cycles of the Earth. Here on your notes on left-hand side, you'll notice that there's cycle definition, three big types. A cycle is a process or a group of processes in which matter repeatedly moves around in a series of reservoirs. So basically matter is moving from place to place to place, back and forth over and over again, millions of years, and it does it millions of times, and that's a cycle. What are the three main cycles we want to know about and we want to be aware of? One is nitrogen. Nitrogen is up in the air, but it also goes into the ground. It goes into the water. It gets processed by bacteria. It goes into plants. And then the plants get eaten by animals, so it goes into the animals. The animals die and it decomposes and it goes back into the air. Then it gets hit by lightning and it changes again. And it stays in the air. And it keeps going like this over and over and over again. In fact, all of that nitrogen that you're breathing in now, there's probably a lot of it that was part of a dinosaur, or at least other organisms. Because of this, we call it a nitrogen cycle. It's constantly getting recycled over and over and over again in our ecosystem. What's our next one? Carbon cycle. You've probably heard of this one. You probably know what this one is. When plants breathe in carbon dioxide, they take it in, they turn it into oxygen, they make it into sugars, the oxygen goes back out, but the carbon dioxide stays in the plant. Eventually the plant breaks down. Sometimes the plant decomposes and the CO2 goes back into the air. Sometimes the CO2 goes down into the ground in the form of coal, natural gas, and oil. Sometimes a forest fire blows through and burns everything, and all that carbon dioxide goes back into the air. Sometimes the CO2 gets dissolved into the water and then the marine plankton feast on it. And sometimes those marine plankton dissolve or decompose and the carbon dioxide goes back into the air. Sometimes they just die and they float down to the bottom of the ocean. They get stuck down here and turn into natural gas and oil. All of this, once again, is part of the carbon dioxide cycle and carbon cycle in general. It moves around over and over and over again. Last one on this is phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is a little bit different than the other ones in the fact that it's never turning into a gas. So this one, nitrogen, it was in a gas. It was in the air. Carbon dioxide, we know that's in the air. But phosphorus, not in the air. Phosphorus right now is mostly found in rocks and soil. Whenever we get erosion where water breaks it down, it goes off into the streams, it goes into the plants, it goes into the ocean, they pick it up, they turn it into energy, they turn it into proteins and other molecules that the body needs in order to survive. They might integrate it into DNA. They need to take that molecule and they need to do things with it. And then when that animal dies and it decomposes and it goes back into the ground, boom, it's back into the rocks and soils, and the rocks and soils get broken apart again. Okay. Last cycle on this particular one, and this one you do not need to write on the left hand side because you're going to be drawing a big old diagram of it on the right hand side when we get into class. Water cycle. You're probably pretty familiar with this. I'm not going to go into great detail. You guys know the basics. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation, boom. That's it. Sometimes we like to throw transpiration in there. Sometimes we like to combine these terms, transpiration, evaporation, evapotranspiration. We like to combine those together sometime. But for now, we'll talk more about that in class. All right, last couple of things here. Ecosystems. I know this is a ton of material and we are almost done with it. What is an ecosystem? Ecosystems are basically communities of organisms and all of their different abiotic factors, things like the water, the sunlight, the environment, everything. Okay. You have that as a definition in your notes. And it says here, organisms in an ecosystem, 3 different types, A, B, and C. What are the 3 different types of organisms in an ecosystem? Boom. Number 1, producer. Producers make their own food. They process carbon dioxide, they make sugar, they make oxygen, all sorts of stuff like that. Consumers are the second type. They come along, they eat those producers. And the last one is the decomposer. Decomposers are primarily bacteria, fungus, things like that. They don't feast on living things, they feast on dead things. And the last thing we're talking about today, carrying capacity. What is it and how does it work? Carrying capacity is the largest population that an environment can support at any given time. It's basically dependent on the available resources, how easily matter and energy are transferred between life forms in the ecosystem and the environment. One easy way to depict it is like this. Animals reproduce, they have babies, and the babies are like filling up a population. Well, how do those animals die? Where do they go? And what does it look like? Well, sometimes weather kills them. It gets too cold. Sometimes human development does it. Sometimes it's loss of habitat. The area they can live in decreases. Sometimes it's starvation, where the animal doesn't have enough food. Sometimes there are tons and tons and tons of predators, and they go out and they kill all those animals. Sometimes a disease sweeps through an area, and it takes them out. Sometimes it's old age. And all of these are like little leaks in this bucket. The bucket is constantly being filled up by the annual production, and all the population is being lost to all these other factors. Well, what happens if this bucket goes all the way down to the bottom? What would happen, and what is required there to make that happen? Well, usually to make a entire population go to zero, we call that extinction. You have to have one of these things get really, really crazy and out of control. Usually, one of the big ones that hits them is starvation and predators. If you have a really, really, really good predator that's really good at hunting something, like humans hunting dodo birds or something crazy like that, you can make this go all the way to zero because the hole that's inside of it leaks out faster than it can fill up. Most often, it's starvation. Just there's not enough food to go around. One year there wasn't enough rain. Because there's not enough rain, there's not enough grass, and boom, that population goes down to almost zero. But in general, it is very hard to get this all the way down to zero. All right, that's it, ladies and gents. I will have some videos attached to this particular lecture. You're responsible for watching those videos. You will notice on your notes on the bottom of the back page it says quick notes for videos at home. Write down important things. Make sure that you write down important things. It will be on a quiz when you guys come into class tomorrow. Have a nice day.